In the last pre-election budget, Treasurer Josh Frydenberg promised the government was bringing the budget back into the black. Well, nothing remotely like a surplus ever materialised. The pandemic made sure of that. And now, just 3 years on, all that talk of budget repair appears to have been thrown overboard in what's shaping up to be a spendathon in the weeks leading up to the election. That's a problem for future budgets, according to Saul Eslake, an independent economist and Vice-Chancellor's Fellow at the University of Tasmania. We spoke earlier. Saul Eslake, thanks for your time. This is shaping up to be a cost of living budget. The government's proposing relief all over the place, which most of us will welcome. But from an economics point of view and a budgetary point of view, do we need stimulus right now?
Well, I think it's appropriate for the government to be seeking to help lower income households, pensioners and other beneficiaries and workers on low wages to cope with increases in the cost of living, which hit them much more proportionately than people on middle to higher incomes, and indeed no less a bastion of economic orthodoxy than the OECD. 2 weeks ago advised governments in advanced economies that they should do that. But they also suggested that those measures should be paid for either out of the additional revenue that governments, including Australia's, will collect from those parts of the economy that benefit from higher prices for energy and grains, and there'll certainly be some of that revenue coming to the budget, and failing that by perhaps raising taxes or cutting government spending in other areas, depending on where economies were in their business cycle.
Which isn't going to happen in an election year, a few months out.
Well, no, certainly not. And I'd make two observations here. The first is that Australian households have racked up an additional $250 billion in bank deposits over the last 2 years. Now, not much of that, if any, will have been racked up by pensioner households or households on low incomes. But the rest of us surely don't need assistance with coping with increases in the cost of living if we've got up to $250 billion collectively more bank deposits than we had 2 years ago. The second point is that the budget's going to be forecasting the lowest unemployment in almost 50 years. Inflation is rising. And in that context, it's hard to see why the economy is indeed in need of any net fiscal stimulus. Indeed, if there's a significant net fiscal stimulus in the budget, it will almost certainly result in additional upward pressure on inflation and ultimately interest rates.
So things could get more expensive as a result of this budget. What are the other dangers, if any, of giving people, for example, relief at the petrol bowser, which is something that everyone's talking about right now?
The problem with that is that it benefits people who don't need assistance as well as those who do. So, as I say, I think it's quite proper for the government to be looking at ways of assisting low-income households, that is, people on pensions or other social security benefits, and people working but on relatively low wages, for whom increases in the costs of petrol and food, and if it comes to it, other energy bills, represents a much bigger proportion of their income than of people in the upper half of the income distribution. So absolutely no criticism of any measures that are directed towards people in that position. But there are better ways of doing that than cutting petrol excise even temporarily, because they benefit people who are in no need of additional assistance at all. It might be unpleasant for them to have to pay more at the petrol pump or at the supermarket checkout, but those households who account for the bulk of the $250 billion increase in bank deposits over the last 2 years are pretty well placed to be able to absorb those increases.
The other issue, I guess, is debt and government debt, which has soared throughout the pandemic. And we've seen, certainly in the last week, a lot of big spending promises already put on the table. We can expect a lot more in the months ahead before the election. Whatever happened to Back in Black and the debt and deficit disaster? Is it still there?
Well, I guess the political answer would be that circumstances have changed and priorities have shifted. While there's no urgent need to start returning the budget to surplus, in my view, given that government spending seems now to be on a permanently higher plane by the equivalent of about 2 percentage points of GDP over the medium term than had been envisaged before the onset of the pandemic. And that increase in the long-term level of government spending seems attributable to the public's very evident desire for more spending on the NDIS, aged care and healthcare. In addition, whether the public wants it or not, we seem likely to get more spending on defence. And whether we like it or not, governments do have to spend more on interest, even at lower interest rates, because of the amount of debt that's been racked up over the last 2 years. It would seem to me that we need to have an intelligent conversation between those who seek to lead us and the broader electorate as to what might be the least economically damaging and fairest ways of raising an additional 2 percentage points of GDP in taxation revenue, not next year or even necessarily over the 4-year forward estimates period, but over the medium term. Sadly, I don't think that's a conversation we're going to have at all between now and whenever the election is held.
Saul Eslake, always good to talk to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David.
Saul Eslake there, an independent economist.